I used to live in a house where my bed was positioned right in front of a long, dark corridor. Every night, I would lie there, staring into the emptiness of that hallway, feeling a sense of unease settling in my chest. There was something about that corridor, something I couldn't quite explain, that made my stomach churn with fear. It wasn't the kind of fear you can pinpoint. It was as if something was watching me, but I didn't know what it was. At first, I thought it was just my imagination running wild. I was just a kid, and I had heard stories about things that go bump in the night, but the uneasiness wouldn't go away. The longer I looked into the corridor, the stronger the feeling became, like invisible eyes were locked on me, studying my every move. I couldn't shake it, no matter how hard I tried. There was a constant chill in the air whenever I faced that corridor, a cold that seemed to seep into my bones. Every night, I would try to sleep, but that nagging feeling of being observed kept me awake. At first, I couldn't make sense of it. Why did I feel this way? What was it about the hallway that made everything seem so wrong? One night, as I lay in bed, staring at the dark corridor as usual, I noticed something that made my heart stop. A shadow, blacker than the darkness around it, slowly began to move towards my room. At first, I thought it was just the play of light and shadow, but there was something wrong about it, something that didn't feel natural. The shadow seemed to shift and stretch, moving as though it had a mind of its own, like it was deliberately approaching me. My pulse quickened as I watched it inch closer, my breathing shallow. I felt a chill in the air that wasn't just from the cool night breeze. It was as though the very atmosphere around me was thickening with danger. The sensation of being watched intensified, but this time it wasn't just a feeling. I could almost sense the shadow's intent. It was as if it was after me, closing in with a malevolent purpose. I tried to turn away, to pretend it wasn't there, but my body froze. My eyes were glued to it, even though every instinct screamed at me to look away. The shadow seemed to grow darker, more defined, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it wanted something from me, something I couldn't understand, but something I feared deeply. The more I focused on it, the more real it became. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but my voice was stuck in my throat. The fear was overwhelming, like a weight pressing down on my chest, and the closer it came, the harder it was to breathe. It wasn't just a shadow, it was a threat, and I felt every fiber of my being screaming to escape, but my body refused to move. The fear was unlike anything I had ever felt before. It wasn't just in my mind, it gripped every part of my body. I tried to move, to get up and run, but my body refused to obey. It was as if I had no control over it anymore. My muscles were locked, frozen in place, and the only thing I could do was watch in horror as the shadow continued to creep closer, its presence suffocating. I tried to scream, but my throat was tight, as if a cold hand had clamped down on it. No sound escaped, and every breath I took felt heavier than the last. It was as if the fear had paralyzed me, both physically and mentally. I could see the shadow clearly now, its form becoming more solid, more threatening, and yet I couldn't do a single thing to stop it. My mind screamed for movement, for escape, but my body betrayed me. The longer I lay there, the more I felt trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. My thoughts became jumbled, desperate. It was as if the shadow was controlling me, weaving itself into my very being. I was helpless, unable to fight back against whatever dark force had taken hold of me. I felt like a puppet on strings, bound by an unseen hand, and the more I struggled, the deeper I sank into the paralysis. After what felt like an eternity, I managed to move just barely. My body trembled with the effort, and every step I took felt like a monumental struggle against an invisible force. I tried to get out of bed, to distance myself from whatever malevolent presence lurked in the hallway, but it was as if the fear was still attached to me, following me, never letting go. My heart pounded in my chest, and I was drenched in cold sweat, but the urge to run, to escape, pushed me forward. I began to rationalize, trying to explain away what was happening. Maybe it was just my imagination, or perhaps the house was just creaking and settling, causing the shadow to seem real. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just my mind playing tricks on me. Every night, without fail, the shadow would appear, always in the same spot, always watching me. It wasn't something I could dismiss or ignore anymore. I tried to convince myself it was a coincidence, that it couldn't possibly be the same thing every time. But then I realized, no matter how many times I moved, no matter where I turned in my room, the shadow always seemed to find me. It was as if it had a mind of its own, an uncanny ability to track me, as if it knew exactly where I was hiding. The more I thought about it, the less sense it made, and yet the fear remained constant, oppressive, and unrelenting. The logical explanations were no comfort. Each time the shadow appeared, it felt more real, more alive. I couldn't escape it, no matter how hard I tried. It was as if I was trapped in a nightmare that wouldn't end, and no matter what I did, the darkness seemed to be closing in on me. I couldn't deny it anymore, the shadow was real. It wasn't just a trick of my mind, or a figment of my imagination born from fear. It was there lurking in the hallway, creeping closer each night. No matter how much I tried to convince myself otherwise, I knew something malevolent was watching me. The air in the house felt heavy, oppressive, like the walls themselves were closing in. I couldn't escape it, and the more I tried, the more trapped I felt in that place. Nights became unbearable. Even when I closed my eyes, I could still feel its presence, an ever-looming threat just beyond the edge of my vision. I tried sleeping with the lights on, thinking maybe that would keep the shadow at bay, but it didn't matter. It would still appear, moving ever so slowly, just out of reach, as if it were waiting for the perfect moment to strike. My attempts to avoid it only made it worse. The more I resisted, the more persistent it became. With each passing night, the fear grew deeper. I could feel my sanity slipping away as the shadow seemed to consume more of my thoughts. It wasn't just a haunting, it was as if it had become part of my reality. I could no longer tell if it was real or if my fear had transformed it into something worse, but the feeling that it was waiting for me, patiently biding its time, never left. The fear was no longer just about the shadow itself, it was about what the shadow represented. It felt like a constant reminder that I was powerless, trapped in my own home with no way out. Each time I thought I was safe, I would feel it again, the icy chill of dread creeping up my spine. It was relentless, and no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, the shadow stayed, just out of reach, but always watching, always waiting. My friends and I had been looking forward to this fishing trip for weeks. It was a quiet weekend, and one of my friend's father had arranged the whole thing. We planned to meet at midnight, a time when the river would be peaceful, and the fish were said to be biting. There was a sense of excitement in the air as we all piled into one car, eager for a night of fishing and jokes. When we arrived at the river, the atmosphere was calm, almost serene. The moonlight reflected off the water, creating a soft glow that made everything feel even more peaceful. We set up our gear, making jokes and teasing each other, the kind of banter that only happens when a group of friends is comfortable and carefree. It seemed like the perfect night for fishing, and I couldn't have imagined that anything would go wrong. We started casting our lines, the sound of water lapping gently against the shore filling the air. Everything felt normal, even enjoyable. The fish were biting steadily, and we were all in high spirits, talking and laughing, completely unaware that something was about to disturb this peaceful scene. The night seemed to stretch out before us, perfect and undisturbed. Around 12:30 a.m., everything changed. The fish stopped biting, and the peaceful calm of the river suddenly shifted. The water, which had been still and tranquil, began to ripple unnaturally, as if something large and unseen was disturbing its surface. The sudden change in the atmosphere made my stomach tighten. There was no clear reason for the shift, but it was enough to make us all uneasy. Then, without warning, something large and heavy plunged into the water on the opposite bank. The splash was so violent that it sent waves crashing through the river, making the sound deafening. The sudden noise startled all of us, and we froze, unsure of what to do. The first thought that came to our minds was that it could be some kind of wild animal, maybe an alligator, but none of us were sure. We instinctively took a step back, hearts racing, unsure if we should move or wait. The tension in the air was palpable. We tried to convince ourselves that it was nothing, just an animal doing its thing, but none of us could shake the feeling that something was wrong. The peaceful night we had been enjoying was now clouded with fear. With our lanterns in hand, we slowly began to scan the water, hoping for some kind of explanation. But all we saw were ripples, faint and fleeting, that seemed to taunt us with their mystery. Something was out there, and it wasn't making itself known. Out of nowhere, two pairs of eyes appeared in the distance, reflecting the light from our lanterns with an intensity that made my heart drop. They gleamed in the dark, glowing unnaturally bright, as if they were absorbing the light rather than reflecting it. At first, we all thought it was an alligator, its eyes glowing like that in the night, but something felt off. The way they shone, almost too sharply, sent a chill down my spine. I remember feeling paralyzed for a moment, unable to look away. As the eyes stared back at us, the fear within the group began to grow. We were all on edge, silently exchanging nervous glances, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. The air was thick with unease, and we instinctively started to move back, not wanting to be any closer to whatever it was. The thought of an alligator lurking nearby was terrifying enough, but these eyes, they didn't belong to any animal we knew. They seemed to be watching us, studying us, as if waiting for the right moment to strike. The more we stared, the more I felt a growing sense of dread. The eyes didn't blink, didn't move, but they remained locked on us. It was as if something or someone was watching, and the idea that we were being hunted made the fear unbearable. We all backed up a few more steps, unsure of what to do next. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sounds of our shallow breaths and the distant ripples on the water. The feeling of being observed was overwhelming, and the only thing I knew for sure was that I didn't want to stay there any longer. Suddenly, something moved swiftly toward the shore, moving with a speed that no ordinary animal could match. The water around it churned violently as it approached, its movement unnaturally fast. We all froze, our eyes locked on the shadowy form coming closer to the edge of the river. As it got nearer, we could finally make out the details of the creature, and what we saw left us paralyzed with terror. It was humanoid, but far from anything human. The creature stood at least 2.5 meters tall, its thin body looming over us as it glided effortlessly through the water. Its features were strange, its ears were long and pointed, unlike anything I had ever seen, and it had a long, thin tail that trailed behind it as it moved. The presence it exuded was suffocating, as if it were preparing to attack. There was no mistaking it. We were in the presence of something far beyond our understanding. Panic erupted in the group. We were frozen in fear, our hearts pounding in our chests as we watched the creature approach with a menacing grace. One of the guys, barely able to speak through his terror, shouted, "It's the caboclo dog." The words barely escaped his lips, but they made everything hit home. The realization that we weren't dealing with some ordinary animal made our blood run cold, and in that instant, terror took over. Without thinking, we bolted. We didn't care about our gear, our fishing rods, or anything else. We ran for our lives. My legs felt like jelly, but I pushed myself forward, not daring to look back. The sound of our frantic footsteps and the thumping of our hearts drowned out everything else. The creature was still out there, lurking in the shadows, and we knew we couldn't stop until we were far, far away from that river. We left everything behind and never looked back. We ran non-stop, the sound of our breath heavy in the night air, each step fueled by sheer terror. None of us dared to look back. We knew whatever was behind us was far worse than anything we could comprehend. The fear surged through me like a tidal wave, and every instinct told me to keep moving. When we finally reached the car, we were gasping for air, completely exhausted, but the terror still hadn't left us. We piled into the car, slamming the doors shut as though that could somehow protect us from whatever we had just witnessed. None of us spoke as we drove away, the silence in the car suffocating. We didn't even consider going back to retrieve our fishing gear. We were done. The river, that place where we had once laughed and joked, was now off limits forever. The fear of that creature, of the eyes that had glowed unnaturally in the dark, haunted us. We never spoke about what happened again, but it was always there, lingering in the background whenever we saw each other. The years passed, but the memory of that night never faded. No matter where we were or what we did, there was always a shadow of fear following us. The terror of that humanoid creature, its long tail and strange features, became a part of us, embedded so deeply that we could never forget. Even as time moved on, that night remained a constant, unsettling presence in our minds. We all know the truth, even though we never discuss it anymore. What we saw that night was not of this world. And I don't think any of us will ever be the same again. That encounter, that unnatural creature from the water, left a mark on our souls, one that will never be erased. The trauma from that fishing trip still follows us, and I know deep down we'll never go near that river again.